Welcome to Blue Collar Reformation. PBR here. Today we're talking about the Reformed view of the Jews. Now, we've been talking about this in the last installment. Today we'll continue. And today we're going to talk about the paranoia and petty blame shifting that happens upon the Jews and basically how they're cast within the context of an oppressor-oppressed class. Now, sometimes in history they're treated as the oppressor, and other times in history they're treated as the oppressed. And part of this is that we really can't talk about the claims of Judaism even until we answer this presupposition of the political approach to the Jews rather than the theological claims. So we need to get into some of the background of this. Now, what I want to show you is that basically the theology or the philosophy of the modern world has caused us to have this strain where we can't talk about things clearly and directly because they always have an emotional string attached to them based around whether somebody is oppressed or oppressor. Now, basically what we see is that people will blame the Jews for different things, or they will treat them as a social negative, or they will treat them, batted over to another side, as an oppressed class due to, obviously the history of what's happened to the Jews as an ethnicity. And the problem is we can't really talk about their claims without first clarifying what we're meaning when we say these things. And I think we actually need to explode and reject the entire hypothesis of the oppressor and oppressed class warfare. Now, we need to understand this from history because within the context of history, you have basically three different views of history and the future in Christianity as well as the modern world. The first is post-millennialism, which I'm advocating as the view that is the Reformed view. And there's another subset of post-millennialism called amillennialism. But post-millennialism is basically saying that Christ will return at the end of this time of his kingdom, and he will bring in the new creation. Before the end of this age, the nations will be evangelized, including the Jews. And so there's two views within Reformed theology of either they will be a remnant or they will be converted in the vast majority. The second view is premillennialism, which believes that there will be a time when God will return to working with the Jews at the return of Jesus, that there will be a rebuilding of the temple, and that Jesus will rule literally for 1,000 years, so the 1,000-year millennium for Revelation chapter 20, in Jerusalem. Jesus will rule in Jerusalem, literally and bodily, for 1,000 years, and then the end will come. Now, of course, that's not the Reformed view. It's the view of many in the ancient church and the medieval church, but it's not really the Reformed view. And then there is a view that comes from ancient Greek thinking that works its way into Christianity and then eventually becomes Hegelian modernism. And that is the view of basically what I call three-ageism. So there's three different ages of the world. So they look at the world as basically being split into the Old Testament age of the God of wrath and justice. So they say that was the time of God the Father. And then they look at the age of the Son, which is the age of Christ, where you have basically from the incarnation of Christ until, whatever point the group that claims to be the next age comes up. And then you have the age of the Spirit. So you have the age of wrath and justice, then an age of love, and then an age of the Spirit, where there's an offcasting of all kinds of authority structures and a lack of authority and a lack of clarity as to how we're to live, because basically it's the age of the Spirit. And so people are led by the Spirit. And they're saying that it's another advance forward. And now the idea is that it's basically a evolutionary move to the future. Now, throughout the Middle Ages, you had groups like the Cathari, and then later on the Anabaptists, who believed that they were the beginning of the age of the Spirit, a new age of a fullness and a difference that was not had before. And then in modernism, you have a resurgence of this after the eclipse of everything by the Protestant Reformation. Then you have the rise of modernism, and modernism, especially in the form of Georg Friedrich Hegel's dialectical approach to history. So the dialectic basically works like this. You have an old thesis, right? The old thesis of the way that things are thought and the way that things are in society. And then you have an antithesis to that thesis. The antithesis ends up contradicting, and then there's class warfare, and then finally you come to a higher synthesis, and it's basically a combination of the two. and then you have the new synthesis, the new amalgamation of the two that eventually is confronted by a new thesis or a new antithesis. So that old synthesis becomes the old thesis, and then becomes the uh, the thing that is controverted by a new antithesis. And so it's a cycle that goes over and over again. So basically, what you have is a progress of history. There's a modernist theologian named Jürgen Moltmann who uses the illustration of a sewage treatment plant. That basically God is in the world and he is working himself out in the ages as these revolutions come about, and that you have the new synthesis, which is basically cleaner water, and it just keeps revolving around and keeps cleaning out itself as time goes on. Now, you can see this in the thinking of Marx and Foucault and Derrida and Marcuse, and that basically what you see is that there's always a class warfare, always an oppressor-oppressed approach to things. And so in some cases, it's self-expression. In other cases, it's economic oppression, oppressor. And in other times, it is a racial oppressor-oppressed group dialectic. But always it's dialectic, that you have a need for an overturning of the authority structures of the way that society is by a new antithesis, and then finally you get a higher thesis, and eventually there'll be something else. So basically, every group in this way of thinking who is activist and is seeking for revolution is a pawn in the game of what's happening with this synthesis that's going to come about. So ultimately, they're not really going to get what they want. It's going to be an amalgamation of the two, and eventually progresses forward to a new antithesis that's going to come up. So this is the problem, is that oftentimes when we talk about the Jews, there's basically this either blame shifting that goes upon them, where basically they're treated as an oppressor, or there is a sort of a sympathizing and a approach to them where it says that they must be a special protected group because they are the oppressed. And so it depends upon where they're used at the time. And all I'm saying is that basically in this modernist train of thought, that it's basically a problem of saying that they're a pawn in the game of this larger political and philosophical school of thought. And so what we have to do before we can even engage the truth claims of Judaism is we have to recognize that everybody in the world today has been educated in this way of thinking of basically oppressor and oppressed class. And so we have to reject that and correct that a lot of times before we can even start engaging on it. So in order to understand this, we really have to make everybody angry, because there are people who treat the Jews as a protected class because of either theological or philosophical views, or they treat them as the source of all of their problems, and that there is an antipathy toward the Jews. And both of these are centered in Hegelian dialectic. And once you explode that, then you can finally get to the truth claims of Judaism and start actually explaining the gospel to them. This is PBR signing off.